In the last section, we put together an action creator to fetch our list of posts. In this section, we'll implement a reducer to catch that data and produce our application state. So as before, our reducer will be inside of a new file inside of the reducers folder. We'll make the new file and call it reducer posts.js. Before we start writing the reducer though, don't forget it always needs to be wired up inside of our reducers index file with the combine reducers call. So at the top we will import post reducer, that's the file that we just created, from reducer posts. And then we will replace the existing state pass through right here. That's all it does, it just passes through the state with post reducer. Cool. Now back to the reducer itself. I'm inside of reducer post right now. Again, this is going to be a little bit of boilerplate, so it's stuff we've already gone over, kind of boring stuff, but let's just go ahead and bang through it really quick. So at the top, we'll define our initial state as an object, and then we will immediately write our reducer. So we'll export default function, and our state will be defaulted to initial state, and we get an action every time. Then we'll define our switch statement based on the action type, and by default we will just return state. Just go ahead and pass it right on through. So by default, our posts piece of state will be an object. And if we don't get an action that the reducer cares about, we just return the state. Totally normal boilerplate reducer right here. So let's add the case in which a successful fetch of the posts index come through. So at the top, we're going to need to import the actions type. This is the action that we just created. So we'll import fetch posts from actions index. That's the one that we just created. And then we'll add a case to fetch posts. All right. So this is a good first stab at our reducer right here. Now we've only written a handful of reducers, but you're going to find that they usually end up looking very similar to each other. Almost always something just like this. We always have a single function for the actual reducer, and by convention it contains a switch statement for all the different types of actions that we have flowing through. Now before we go any further, before we kind of dissect our action right here, we need to talk about the structure of our state. Remember, our app state is something that we really want to get right on day one. As much as possible, we want to avoid having to refactor the structure of our state later on. We always can refactor the state. If we make a mistake, if we decide, oops, this is an array, but it really makes more sense for it to be an object or what have you, we can always refactor it later on. But I recommend that you put at least some solid thought into what your state should look like before you start diving in head first. So to that end, we need to think about what our state needs to look like. Let's go back to our mock-up really quick and look at our mock-up, see if we can't get an idea of what we want this to look like. So the index page shows a list of different blog posts. So we definitely need either an object or an array to hold all of these blog posts. Remember, the one really interesting thing about our application is that when we want to show a single blog post, like the post show route, only the show gets the content in the response. So there really is kind of a distinction between the list of blog posts and a single blog post right here. That means that we can't really depend on just having a single list of blog posts. We really need a separate piece of state that holds the current active blog post, the one that we just did a fetch for to show the single post at a time. So this really, again, it really points us to having a separate piece of state like we did in our previous applications, a sort of active post, so to speak, that holds the currently selected post. So let's run with that. We'll have two pieces of state. One is going to be an array, which will hold a list of blog posts that contain only the title and categories, and then we'll have a sort of active post, the post that we are currently showing a detail page for, and that will also include its content right here. So let's reflect that decision inside of our initial state here. At the top, I'm going to add two properties in here. One is going to be all, and it's going to be an empty array. So we'll say this is going to be the list of our blog posts. It's going to be what we want to show on the index page. It's just going to be an array of blog posts from our index route. And then separately, we'll have another key, and it will be post null. And so you can kind of think of this as being our, our individual post, our show action. This is only going to hold a single post, and so we're going to default it to null. Now note that these initial values here are somewhat arbitrary. I could have just as easily provided null here for all, but I'm going to specifically use an array just to kind of communicate intent. This is intended to be a list of blog posts. I definitely want it to be an array, so hey, future developer, when you're looking at this, have the expectation that this is going to be an array. Okay, so our reducer is looking pretty good here. We've got our initial state in place. Let's go ahead and continue with its implementation in the next section.